$2 billion vanished overnight, not stolen in a robbery, not lost in a market crash, but quietly and silently moved through screens, servers, and signatures that no one questioned. Just months earlier, this tech startup was being called the future of Silicon Valley. It had a revolutionary platform, a visionary founder, and investors were lining up. On the surface, it looked like pure innovation, but behind the screens, something else was happening. Money was moving in circles, invoices made no sense, and contracts were impossible to explain. Billions flowed in and disappeared just as fast. No alarms went off, no headlines warned anyone. At the center of it all was one man, a CEO few had ever met in person, always calm, always confident, always one step ahead. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the money was gone. So the question isn't just who did it. The real question is, how did so many smart people miss the signs? At the height of the tech boom, this company seemed unstoppable. It was founded in the heart of Silicon Valley, where billion-dollar ideas are born in garages and turn into global empires almost overnight. The startup promised to disrupt everything: finance, data security, and digital infrastructure all at once. Its pitch was simple, but powerful. A proprietary technology that could process massive financial transactions faster than any system on the market. Cheaper, smarter, safer. Investors loved it. Venture capital firms rushed in with early funding. Then came the private equity money. Then strategic partners. Each new round valued the company higher than the last. Within 3 years, the startup was valued at over $4 billion. Employees spoke about the CEO like a legend, a quiet genius, a former prodigy, someone who rarely gave interviews. But when he did, every word sounded calculated, reassuring. He talked about transparency. He talked about ethics. He talked about building the future. Behind closed doors, the company expanded rapidly: new offices, new subsidiaries, new strategic partners across multiple states and offshore jurisdictions. To outsiders, it looked like smart global expansion, but inside the books, something didn't add up. Revenue was growing faster than users. Costs were scattered across dozens of entities, and no one could clearly explain why a tech startup needed so many shell companies. Still, the money kept coming in, and no one wanted to be the person who slowed down a billion-dollar dream. On the surface, everything screamed success. Quarter after quarter, the numbers were explosive. New partnerships were announced, big-name clients were signed, and fresh revenue streams seemed to pop up from thin air. The company was the darling of the investment world, a rocket ship that only went up. But hidden deep within the dense pages of its financial reports, a strange pattern was emerging, one that almost everyone missed. Huge sums of money would flow into the company from eager investors, only to move out just as quickly. Now, you'd expect a growing company to spend money on salaries, marketing, or research and development. But this wasn't that. The money was disappearing through a web of contracts, consulting agreements, licensing deals, and infrastructure services. The vendors were companies nobody had ever heard of, seemingly random and unconnected. Each individual contract was a work of art. It looked completely legitimate, reviewed by lawyers, properly signed, and stamped with official seals. To an auditor, it just looked like the normal complexity of a fast-growing global business. To regulators, it was a sign of healthy expansion. And to investors, well, it looked like their money was being put to work to generate even more growth. But peel back the layers, and you'd find a startling connection. All those different companies, with their different names and different addresses, were all secretly under the same control. It was a masterfully constructed maze of shell companies layered inside other shell companies. Reality, the entire structure was a sophisticated funnel. Clean, legitimate investment money flowed in at the top. It was then quietly routed through this labyrinth of subsidiaries and third-party vendors, bouncing from one account to another, until its origin became almost impossible to trace. It was financial alchemy. Some of this money was moved offshore, disappearing into jurisdictions with lax banking laws. Some was converted into cryptocurrency and sent through decentralized payment rails, making it even harder to follow. And here's the truly brilliant part: some of it was even funneled back into the company, disguised as new revenue. This created the illusion of a self-sustaining, profitable business, which in turn attracted even more investment. The cycle fed itself. And what made this scheme so dangerous was that, on paper, everything was technically documented. Every transaction had a corresponding invoice. Every payment was backed by a signed contract. Every bank transfer was approved through the proper channels. There wasn't one single obvious illegal transaction you could point your finger at. Instead, there were thousands of small, seemingly innocent transactions, stacked carefully and patiently over time. This wasn't a clumsy smash-and-grab heist. It was a slow, calculated, and deliberate operation, designed to hide in plain sight. The psychology behind it was just as clever. As long as the company's stock price kept climbing, and the growth narrative continued, no one had any incentive to look too closely. Questioning the story meant risking being called a fool for doubting a winner. Investors were happy. Employees were getting paid. And the founders were hailed as visionaries. The illusion was perfect, but illusions, no matter how well crafted, are fragile. They can't last forever. All it takes is one person who is willing to ask the uncomfortable questions, to pull on a single loose thread. All it takes is one person who isn't blinded by the dazzling numbers and decides to look at what's really happening behind the curtain. And in this story, that one person was about to change everything. Thanks for watching. If you found this story fascinating, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives. It started with a question no one wanted to ask. Not from an investor, not from a regulator, but from inside the company. A mid-level finance manager noticed something strange while preparing an internal report. Routine task. Just reconciling payments between departments. One number didn't match, then another. Small gaps at first, easy to ignore. Easy to explain away as timing issues or accounting delays, but the deeper they looked, the worse it got. Money was being approved without clear authorization trails. Invoices were being paid to vendors no one in the office could identify. Entire departments were billed for services they never used. When the finance manager raised concerns, the response was calm. They were told the structures were strategic, that the CEO had approved everything, that this level of complexity was normal for a fast-scaling tech company. But something felt off. A private message was sent to another colleague, then another, quietly. A small group started comparing notes. They realized the problem wasn't one missing transaction. It was hundreds, millions moving without operational logic. Entities that existed only on paper. Payments that looped back in strange ways. The moment that changed everything came during a routine investor update. A senior executive casually referenced revenue that didn't exist in the internal system. That's when it became clear. The public story and the internal numbers were not the same. And once that realization hit, there was no going back. Because asking the next question would mean putting everything at risk. Careers, reputations, and possibly their lives as they knew them. But silence was no longer an option. Someone decided to speak. The message wasn't dramatic. No accusations. No threats. Just a quiet report sent to the wrong place. Or maybe the right one. An anonymous tip landed on the desk of an external audit firm tied to one of the company's largest investors. At first, it looked like nothing more than internal confusion, growing pains, miscommunication. But auditors are trained to look where others don't. They followed one transaction, then another, then dozens more. What they found was disturbing. Money wasn't just moving fast, it was moving in patterns. Funds entered from venture capital accounts in the US, passed through domestic subsidiaries, then disappeared into overseas entities with no real employees, no physical offices, and no clear business purpose. Each time investigators thought they'd reached the end of the trail, it split again. A new company, a new account, a new justification. By the time regulators were quietly notified, more than $800 million had already become nearly impossible to trace. Behind closed doors, panic set in. Board meetings turned tense. Executives stopped making eye contact. Emails went unanswered. The CEO, once always available, suddenly became difficult to reach. He blamed banking delays, then regulatory bottlenecks, then misinterpretation of complex structures. But the explanations kept changing, and then came the moment no one was prepared for. During a scheduled internal review, investigators uncovered a set of parallel financial records, clean books for investors, and another set that told a very different story. That's when the true scale emerged. This wasn't mismanagement. This wasn't creative accounting. This was intentional. Billions had been quietly washed through the company, piece by piece, right under everyone's nose. And now that the truth was surfacing, there was only one question left. Where was the CEO? And how much time did anyone have left before everything collapsed? The collapse didn't happen with a headline. It happened with silence. One morning, employees arrived at the office to find key systems offline. Internal communication tools stopped working. Finance dashboards showed frozen numbers that refused to update. By noon, the board called an emergency meeting. By evening, the CEO was unreachable. Phone calls went straight to voicemail. Emails bounced back unanswered. His calendar was suddenly empty. Within 48 hours, the truth spilled into the open. Bank accounts were locked. Partners suspended contracts. Investors demanded answers that no one could give. Regulators stepped in. What they found was devastating. The company's cash reserves were gone. Not lost, not misallocated, gone. The startup that once boasted billions in valuation filed for emergency bankruptcy protection. Thousands of employees were laid off without warning. Stock options became worthless overnight. Investors began to realize the painful truth. They hadn't invested in innovation. They had funded a laundering machine disguised as a tech company. As investigators traced the final transactions, one detail became impossible to ignore. In the weeks leading up to the collapse, massive sums had been moved out, not randomly, but with precision. Almost as if someone knew exactly when to leave. And by the time law enforcement issued formal warrants, the CEO had already crossed borders. No goodbye message, no public statement, no explanation, just a digital footprint, and billions that would never come back. But the most shocking part was still to come. Because the CEO wasn't the only one who knew what was happening. As investigators dug deeper, a truth emerged that stunned everyone involved. The CEO hadn't acted alone. Internal messages recovered from encrypted backups revealed quiet coordination. Senior executives, legal advisors, trusted operators who understood exactly how the system worked and chose to stay silent. Some approved transactions they didn't understand, others understood and approved them anyway, in exchange for bonuses, equity, access. One executive turned state witness. And what they revealed changed the entire narrative. The startup wasn't just used to move money. It was designed for it. From day one, the corporate structure, the partnerships, the complexity, all of it had been engineered to move massive sums without triggering immediate suspicion. The tech product, real, but secondary, a convincing cover. By the time authorities reconstructed the full picture, the number was undeniable. Nearly $2 billion had passed through the company. Only a fraction would ever be recovered. The CEO was eventually located abroad, living quietly under a different identity. Extradition battles dragged on. Years passed. But for investors, employees, and partners, the damage was already done. Careers ended. Retirements vanished. Trust evaporated. And that's the real lesson of this story. Because this wasn't about bad luck. It was about blind trust. Here's what every investor must learn from this case. Never confuse complexity with intelligence. Never mistake confidence for integrity. Never assume growth means legitimacy. And never invest in what you don't fully understand. The most dangerous crimes don't look like crimes at all. They look like opportunity. And by the time you realize the difference, it's already too late. Before you leave, if this story shocked you, subscribe now. Because this wasn't an isolated case. Stories like this are happening right now, hidden inside startups, crypto platforms, real estate empires, and billion-dollar companies you hear about every day. On the Billion-Dollar Crime, we expose how money, power, and betrayal collide, and the lessons every investor and entrepreneur must learn before it is too late. If this video made you think differently about trust, growth, or too good to be true opportunities, hit the like button. It tells YouTube to show you more stories like this. And don't stop here. On your screen right now is the next story of another empire, another collapse, another lesson that could save you millions. Watch it next.